Hello everyone, welcome to the second session discussing the head and neck practicals. In this practical we will continue talking about the skull. The last session we talked about the norma frontalis or the anterior view. Now we'll talk about the norma verticalis, the superior view, the posterior view, the inferior from the external and internal aspects, and the lateral view of the skull. So let's start. This station deals with the superior view or the norma verticalis of the skull. As you can see here, anteriorly it's formed of the frontal bone. The frontal bone articulates posteriorly with the two parietal bones here, and the articulation between them is denoted by this transversely running tortuous suture. This is known as the coronal suture. Okay. The frontal bone sometimes might show midlines here, longitudinal suture. This is known as the metopic suture, and it represents the line of fusion between the two halves of the frontal bone during development. Okay. Posteriorly, the two parietal bones articulate with each other in a longitudinally running suture that passes posteriorly. This is known as the sagittal suture, uniting the two parietal bones together. The point where the coronal and the sagittal suture meet is known as the bregma, and this represents the side of the anterior fontanelle. Towards the posterior aspect of the sagittal suture on either side of the midline are small perforations or small foramina on either side of the midline. This foramen belongs to the emissary set of foramina that connect the scalp veins with the cranial veins. This particular foramen connects the scalp veins with the superior sagittal sinus. Okay. This is the posterior view of the skull, or it's known also as the occipital view, because it's made mostly by the occipital bone. Here is the squamous part of the occipital bone articulating superiorly or anteriorly with the pair of the parietal bones, and the uniting suture between them is the lambdoid suture. We can also see the termination of the sagittal suture running into the lambdoid suture, and the point of union of the lambdoid suture with the sagittal suture is known as the lambda, which is representing the side of the posterior fontanelle. More laterally, the squamous part of the occipital bone articulates here with the mastoid part of the temporal bone on the other side, and the suture between them is the occipito-mastoid suture. Okay. The squamous part of the temporal bone low down here shows a boson of bone. This is known as the external occipital protuberance. From the external occipital protuberance, there is a line that extends on either side laterally towards the base of the mastoid process here. This ridge of bone is curved, being slightly convex upwards, and this is known as the superior nuchal line. The line demarcates the scalp superiorly from the neck inferiorly. That's all for the occipital view. Here is the second station, which deals with the inferior or the basal view of the skull. In its most posterior aspect here, it's formed by the occipital bone. The part that it occupies the foramen magnum. The part that occupies the foramen magnum is known as the basal part of the occipital bone, or the basi-occipit, while the part that lies posterior to this, extending towards the external occipital protuberance, is the squamous part of the occipital bone. Here we can see the external occipital protuberance. From the external occipital protuberance towards the posterior margin of the foramen magnum is a longitudinal sagittal crest of bone. This is known as the external occipital crest. From the external occipital protuberance laterally, we can also see the superior nuchal line passing, being curved upwards towards the basis of the mastoid process on other sides. More anteriorly, other curved ridges of bone extend laterally from the midpoint of the external occipital protuberance, and these are the inferior nuchal lines. Moving towards the foramen magnum, the margins of the foramen magnum give attachment to the fibrous live dura mater as it sweeps downward from the middle cranial fossa towards the vertebral column. The posterior margin addition gives attachment to the posterior atlanto-occipital membrane, while the anterior in front of the dura mater, it gives attachment to the ligaments that extend upwards from the odontoid process of the axis. On either side of the anterior half of the foramen magnum are two bony projections. These are convex kidney-shaped structures. These are known as the occipital condyles that articulate with the superior articular facet in the lateral mass of the atlas. Posterior to the occipital condyles, here there is a shallow fossa. This fossa is known as the posterior condylar fossa. Sometimes it's perforated by a foramen. This foramen through which the pin passes is the posterior condylar foramen. The foramen gives passage to an emissary vein that connects the sigmoid sinus with the suboccipital venous plexus. And just above the occipital condyles here, there is an opening. This opening is the opening of the hypoglossal canal that transmits the hypoglossal nerve. Anterior to the condyle is the anterior condylar fossa here. It's very shallow. It's known as the anterior condylar fossa. More anterior to the foramen magnum, the basi-occipit becomes fused with the basi-sphenoid, and here it shows a midline bony projection. This is known as the pharyngeal tubercle that gives attachment to the pharyngobasilar fascia. More laterally here, the squamous part of the temporal bone fuses with the mastoid. The squamous part of the occipital bone fuses with this mastoid part of the temporal bone and the occipital-temporal fissure. The base of the mastoid process is grooved here by the attachment of the posterior digastric muscle, posterior belly of digastric muscle, and medial to this there is a groove on the occipitomastoid suture. This is made by the occipital artery. Anterior to the mastoid process, there is a spike-like bony projection of various length. Here, this is known as the styloid process. Here, the styloid process gives attachment to three muscles and a ligament. Okay, these are the stylohyoid. The muscles are the stylohyoid, the styloglossus, and the stylopharyngeus, while the ligament is the stylohyoid ligament. The temporal bone here between the bases of the styloid and mastoid process is perforated by this foramen. It gives passage to the facial nerve and the stylomastoid branch of the posterior auricular artery. Medial to the styloid process, the bone shows a large fossa. This is known as the jugular fossa. It's completed by the occipital bone to form the jugular foramen. Okay, this is the jugular foramen. And this foramen gives passage to a number of structures. In its most posterior part, it gives passage to the internal jugular vein, and anterior to this, from anterior to posterior, it gives passage to the inferior petrosal sinus, the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve number 9, the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10, and finally the accessory nerve, cranial nerve number 11. So it gives passage to two venous structures. These are the internal jugular vein, the inferior petrosal sinus, and the three cranial nerves, cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, cranial nerve 10, vagus, and cranial nerve 11, which is the accessory nerve. Anterior to the jugular foramen, there is another foramen. This is a small foramen. This is known as the carotid foramen that leads into the carotid canal through which the internal carotid artery passes. Lateral to the styloid process is the tympanic part of the temporal bone. This forms the inferior margin of the external acoustic meatus, and its superior margin is being completed by the squamous part of the temporal bone. Anterior to the tympanic part of the temporal bone, the inferior surface of the squamous part of the temporal bone in this area, which is covered by this plastic portion, is excavated, forming a fossa. This is known as the mandibular fossa. In front of this mandibular fossa, there is an elevated eminence of bone. This is known as the articular eminence. This mandibular fossa and the articular eminence form the superior articular surface for the temporomandibular joint. More anteriorly, the squamous part of the temporal bone articulates with the greater wing of the sphenoid. These form the superior wall or the superior surface of the infratemporal fossa. Here, this part of the greater wing of the sphenoid bone forming the superior wall of the infratemporal fossa is perforated here at the base of the spine of the sphenoid by a foramen. This foramen is known as the foramen spinosum. Okay, the foramen spinosum, and this foramen gives passage to the middle meningeal vessels as well as the nervus spinosus, the meningeal branch of the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve. Anterior medial to the foramen spinosum is a larger oval foramen. This is known as the foramen ovale. This foramen ovale connects to the middle cranial fossa, and it gives passage to a number of structures. These are the trigeminal. These are the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve, as well as the motor root of the trigeminal nerve, the accessory meningeal artery, the lesser superficial petrosal nerve, and an emissary vein connecting the pterygoid venous plexus with the cavernous sinus. Okay, so this is the foramen ovale. Lateral, more medial to the foramen ovale, between the basi occipit, here, the greater wing of the sphenoid, and the apex of the petrous part of the temporal bone, is an irregular foramen. This foramen is known as the Foramen Lazarum, which is covered in life by fibrous connective tissue that has swept across from the periosteum of adjacent bones. Nothing passes through this foramen except two. These are the meningeal branch of the ascending pharyngeal artery and an emissary vein. More anteriorly, we can see the medial and lateral pterygoid plates hanging downwards from the pterygoid plate of the sphenoid bone. This is the medial pterygoid plate, and this is the lateral pterygoid plate. The inferior aspect of the medial pterygoid plate here shows a hook-like projection of bone. This hook-like projection is known as the Pterygoid Hamulus. The posterior wall of the medial pterygoid plate is concave, extends downward here, and then it divides into two ridges. This posterior wall divides into two ridges that pass outwards. It passes laterally, enclosing between them this fossa. This is known as the scaphoid fossa, which gives rise to one of the muscles of the palate. This is known as the Tensory Palatai muscle. The point where the medial pterygoid plate makes attachment or fuses with the base of the skull shows a projection here that passes back posteriorly towards the foramen lazarum, and this is known as the pterygoid tubercle. Lateral to the medial pterygoid plate is the lateral pterygoid plate here. This lateral pterygoid plate gives rise to two of the muscles of mastication. From its medial and lateral surfaces, it gives rise to medial and lateral pterygoid muscles, respectively. Still more anteriorly here, one can see the palate, the hard palate, with the alveolar processing being attached to its lateral and anterior walls. These are the processes of the maxilla. More anteriorly in the midline, just behind the alveolar process, the hard palate shows an opening. This is known as the incisive foramen that leads upwards into the incisive canal. Okay, this incisive foramen transmits two structures. These are the greater palatine artery and the sphenopalatine nerve. More posteriorly, just medial to the third molar tooth, there is another opening here. This opening is known as the greater palatine foramen. That leads into the greater palatine canal. This foramen transmits the greater palatine artery and nerve. Posterior to this are a number of foramina, usually two. These are known as the lesser palatine foramina that transmit the lesser palatine neurovascular structures. That's all for the base of the skull. Now we move to the third session, which discusses the internal features of the cadaveria and the internal feature of the posterior cranial fossa. Here in the cranial vault or the cranial cap, the internal aspect shows a midline sagittal groove that widens as it passes posteriorly. This groove is indented on by the passage of the superior sagittal sinus. Within this groove and on its other side laterally, we can see many pitons and perforations and foramina. These are made by the arachnoid granulations, which are aggregations of the arachnoid villi. These are evaginations of the arachnoid matter of the arachnoid matter into the superior sagittal sinus and its lateral blood legs. More laterally, here are indentations of these are indentations of the branches of the middle meningeal vessels and branches of the middle meningeal artery and tributaries of the middle meningeal vein extending upwards towards the cranial vault. The internal aspect of the cranial base is found in 3 levels. They look like the steps of a ladder. This is the anterior cranial fossa. At a lower level is the middle cranial fossa, and the lowest one is the posterior cranial fossa. We'll start talking about the posterior cranial fossa. The anterior boundary of the cranial fossa here medially is made by this sloping concave ridge of bone. This is known as the clivus. Anterolaterally is made by the posterior wall of the petrous part of the temporal bone, while the posterior wall or the posterior limit of the posterior cranial fossa is made by the squamous part of the occipital bone. Okay. The upper limit of the posterior cranial fossa is level with the on the external surface with the superior temporal with the superior nuchal line. This is indented internally by the presence of the groove that extends laterally on either side transversely from the internal occipital protuberance. These are known as the transverse. These are the ridges made or the grooves made by the transverse sinus. From the internal occipital protuberance, a vertical or longitudinal ridge of bone extends downward between it and the posterior border of the foramen magnum. This is known as the internal occipital crest. This internal occipital crest gives attachment to the false cerebral line that separates the 2 cerebellar hemispheres from each other. Above the internal occipital protuberance, there is a sagittal groove. This is the posterior termination of the superior sagittal sinus. This groove turns out to turn either to the right or the left side to be continuous with the groove made by the transverse sinus. Usually it turns to the right, and the left here commences at the internal occipital protuberance and extends laterally. The transverse ridge on either side passes to become continuous with another groove. This groove is known as the sigmoid sinus. This groove is made by the sigmoid sinus. It lies within the internal aspect of the mastoid part of the temporal bone. It continues downward towards the occipital bone. Here it leads into the large foramen here, or this is known as the internal or the jugular foramen that transmits the internal jugular vein and the vagus, the glossopharyngeal, and the accessory, as well as the inferior petrosal sinus. Above the jugular foramen, here, the petrous part of the temporal bone shows an opening. This opening is known as the internal acoustic meatus, which transmits both roots of the facial nerve as well as the vestibulocochlear nerve and the labyrinthine branches of the basilar artery. More medially, here the petrous part of the temporal bone articulates with the base occiput and this fissure, which is grooved here by the presence or the running of the inferior petrosal sinus. This inferior petrosal sinus extends down prior to the jugular foramen. Medial, more medial to the jugular foramen here, there is a rounded eminence of bone. This is known as the jugular tubercle and the occipital bone. This jugular tubercle lies opposite the occipital. Here it lies opposite the occipital condyles. In between the occipital condyles and the jugular tubercle is an opening. This is the opening of the hypoglossal canal that transmits the hypoglossal nerve to the two roots of the hypoglossal nerve. In this station, we'll be discussing the anterior and the middle cranial fossae. The anterior cranial fossa, as you can see here, is bounded anteriorly by the frontal bone, while posteriorly here is bounded by the sphenoid bone in the midline, by the body of the sphenoid bone, and more laterally by the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone. The floor of the middle cranial fossa, of the anterior cranial fossa, lies level with the superior orbital margin externally, and it's made mainly by the orbital part or the orbital plate of the frontal bone, with contribution of small bones that will be discussed. Anteriorly, the anterior cranial fossa is marked by the presence of a ridge here in the midline, sagittally. This ridge is known as the frontal crest. The frontal crest gives attachment to the falx cerebri, the fibrous the dura mater that lies between the two cerebral hemispheres. Okay, as the anterior cranial fossa lodges the frontal lobes of the brain. This crest or frontal crest leads posteriorly into an opening. This opening is known as the foramen cecum. It's covered in life by fibrous layer of dura mater, and sometimes it transmits an emissary vein, connecting an emissary vein. More posteriorly, here is the floor is made in the midline by the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. This cribriform plate of ethmoid bone posterior to the foramen cecum shows an upward projection of bone. This is known as the crista galli. On either side of the crista galli, there is an opening, is known as the nasal slit. This nasal slit gives passage to vessels and nerve connecting the nose with the anterior cranial fossae. The crista galli itself also gives attachment to the falx cerebri. The cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone shows many perforations that might reach up to 20 or more. These perforations or foramina give passage to the olfactory nerves, and these perforations give the bone a sieve-like appearance, and hence the term cribriform plate. Posteriorly, the cribriform plate articulates with the smooth part of the body of the sphenoid bone. This is known as the jugum, or the body of the sphenoid bone. While the frontal bone more laterally articulates with the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, so that it forms the posterior boundary of the anterior cranial fossa, and this lesser wing is projected its medial end projected backwards as the anterior clinoid process. So far, this is all about the anterior cranial fossa. Now we move to the middle cranial fossa. So you can see here the middle cranial fossa is butterfly shaped. The body of the butterfly is small and is made by the body of the sphenoid bone, while the wings of the butterfly extend more laterally, being formed by the grating wing of the sphenoid, and posterior laterally here by the anterior aspect of the petrous part of the temporal bone. The body of the sphenoid bone is hollowed out here by the pituitary gland, forming the pituitary fossa or the sella turcica, the Turkish saddle. The sella turcica is bounded anteriorly by a hump here, a transverse ridge of bone. This is known as the tuberculum celli. The tuberculum celli terminates on either side in a rounded bony eminence. This is known as the middle clinoid process. Okay. Posteriorly, there is a transverse ledge of bone. This is known as the dorsum celli. the dorsum celli terminates on each side in another rounded eminence. This is known as the posterior clinoid process. In front of the tuberculum celli, another transverse groove runs, and this is the chiasmatic sulcus. It does not contain or lodges the optic chiasma, as the optic chiasma is located well above and posterior to it. This chiasmatic sulcus leads laterally beneath the anterior clinoid process into a foramen. Okay, this foramen is known as the optic canal, and the optic canal transmits the optic nerve and the ophthalmic artery from the middle cranial fossa towards the orbit. The side of the body of the sphenoid bone is also grooved here. This groove is made by the internal carotid artery running within the cavernous sinus. This internal carotid artery emanates from the carotid canal here, and then it runs forward to groove the side of the body of the sphenoid bone here. Lateral to this, the floor of the middle cranial fossa, or the wing of the butterfly, is made by the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. Between the greater wing of the sphenoid bone, the apex of the petrous part of the temporal bone, and the clivus here, there is an irregular opening. This irregular opening is known as the Foramen Lazarum, okay, which is covered by fibrous neuromata. More lateral, anterior lateral to this, the greater wing of the sphenoid, lateral to the Foramen Lazarum, the greater wing of the sphenoid bone here is perforated by a small foramen just anterior to the petrous part of the temporal bone. This foramen is known as the foramen spinosum, as being seen in the base of the skull externally, and it transmits the middle meningeal vessels as well as the nervus spinosus, which is the meningeal branch of the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve. From this foramen, a groove extends forward and laterally. This groove is made by the middle meningeal vessels that it has exerted through the foramen spinosum, and here these vessels, as have been noted by its impressions, divide into anterior and posterior branches. The posterior branch running within the internal aspect of the squamous part of the temporal bone, and the anterior one extends upwards within a tunnel of bone that lies opposite the pterion here. Anterior and somewhat medial to the foramen spinosum is the foramen ovale. Okay, here is the foramen ovale that transmits the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve, its motor root, the accessory meningeal artery, and its vein, accompanying vein, the lesser superficial petrosal nerve, and the epidural vein. Still anterior medial to this foramen is another foramen, which is the foramen rotundum, more rounded foramen. This foramen rotundum leads towards the pterygopalatine foramen, or the pterygopalatine fossa. Posterior lateral, or more lateral to the foramen lazarum, the apex of the petrous part of the temporal bone in this region shows a fossa is excavated. This is known as the trigeminal impression. It's produced. It has been produced by the trigeminal ganglion. More posteriorly and laterally, the upper border of the petrous part of the temporal bone is grooved here by the superior petrosal sinus. Lateral to this, in the posterior lateral aspect of the floor of the middle cranial fossa, there is an elevation or an eminence of bone. This is known as the arcuate eminence, produced by one of the semicircular canals of the internal ear, namely the anterior semicircular canal. Anterior and more medial to this arcuate eminence, the anterior aspect of the petrous part of the temporal bone shows a groove, a small or a tiny groove that leads towards the foramen lazarum. This groove is made by the greater superficial petrosal nerve. Still, anterior lateral to it is another small groove that leads towards the foramen ovale. This is made by the lesser superficial petrosal nerve. That's all for the middle cranial fossa.